Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brett Perlman, and welcome to the Center for Houston's Future Energy and Climate Webcast series. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the Center aims to convene business, government, and community stakeholders to address the most important issues in the greater Houston region through strategic planning and collaboration. This year, we're running two webcast series, our Energy and Climate webcast series, and our series on leadership in the post-pandemic era. And you'll hear more about our future programs in a second. But without further ado, we really have a great program today, so I'd like to introduce our speakers. Amy Myers Jaffe is currently the Managing Director at Tufts University's Climate Policy Lab and Research Professor at the Fletcher School. She's the author of several books, including her most recent, Energy's Digital Future, Harnessing Innovation for American Resilience and National Security, which we'll be discussing today. She's also a global expert on energy policy and sustainability, and has directed energy and sustainability research at the Council of Foreign Relations at the University of California, Davis, and of course at Rice's Baker Institute. She's been a great friend for the center and very happy to have her with us today. Raj Mankad is the op-ed editor at the Houston Chronicle, and over his career, he's edited and written for publications that specialize in economics, philosophy, literature, architecture, science, and health. He has a PhD and master's from the University of Houston Creative Writing Program and a BA from Northwestern University. Go Cats. We're going to be incorporating a Q&A into the discussion, so please use the chat feature in your Zoom app to submit your questions and to engage in the conversation. Also, if you're interested in ordering an autographed copy of Amy's new book, please sign up on the website. I think we're going to put the link in the chat, and we'll include you in our book order. So Amy and Raj, thank you so much for being here, and look forward to hearing the discussion.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much for having me. And I just want to start off by talking about how I came to read this book. I've known Amy for several years. I worked at Rice while she was there as well. But in my capacity as the op-ed editor at the Chronicle, I'm always on the hunt for book excerpts to run in our Sunday section. And I have to make this confession that I often don't read the whole books. I'm looking for the most interesting nugget. And but when I got Amy's new book, Energy's Digital Future, I couldn't put the thing down, and I read every page and every word. I think because the topic is so urgent, right? How it's basically about how we can take on this climate change, climate crisis, and but also because of the way it was written, because it mixes history and reflections on our personal experience, and also this sort of stone cold analysis that's rooted in years of research in the oil and gas industry. So it's a tremendous book. I really recommend it. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is sort of how did this idea for this book come about? How did you get started?
Well, I'll tell you how the book got started. Many of you might know who are listening today, Andrew Karshner, who got his start in Texas in the wind industry, later went on to be the Deputy Secretary for Renewable Energy under G.W. Bush, and now is a senior strategist at Google, and most recently, the latest board member at ExxonMobil through this proxy fight that just took place a few months ago. And Andy and I were sitting around having lunch at the Google headquarters. And I was doing my usual, complaint about this and that. And we started talking about the fact that I'd had this experience where I fly back to Houston and people were completely unaware of the digital technologies that were going to come out of Silicon Valley and completely change how we do everything. And the people in Silicon Valley had these really out of the market ideas about what energy prices were going to be because they had no idea. It's like shale didn't exist to them. And so it was like this collision course. And Andy and I had this idea that we would throw a retreat, like an intellectual learning retreat. And we would invite leaders from Texas and leaders from California, from the tech industry, and at a winery in Napa Valley, and have people understand what each other were thinking when it comes to the energy future. And it was an incredible 3 days. Lots of
there were no fist fights.
No
there were no
fist
fist
fights.
fights.
Well, you know, there's a lot of wine. No fist fights. And it led to some very interesting partnerships. You know, Shell made a partnership on hydrogen in California. And I remember going to a Christmas party at the home of the CTO of Chevron, and the head of Oracle's oil and gas division was there. I'm like, I don't understand. He's like, we met at your retreat. So there was really like a lot of both synergy and like knowledge that was imparted about what the competition for you know, fuels and technology was going to be like moving forward. And Andy liked to say that in the United States, technology was sort of like we just hit the jackpot like 100 different times in 100 different ways, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of bringing down the cost of solar, in terms of applications for batteries, in terms of the shale. I mean, there are just so many things happening that were so transformative. And that gave us the idea that, you know, well, first it was like, we should do a book. And then it was like, well, maybe I'll do a book. And we formed this study group of about 25 or 30 leaders from different companies, because what we wanted to really understand is not what's the science of this or the science of that. The other people can write about that better than I can. We wanted to understand what companies were really planning to do. And I just leave the group with just this, you know, sort of funny observation where I'm driving around in Silicon Valley and interviewing people about what technologies are coming next. And I was telling them how I wanted to have a chapter on automated vehicles, right? So driverless cars, would they be delivering pizza? Would they be, would it be Amazon bringing you goods to your home through e-commerce? Or would you and I just simply, you know, no longer hold the steering wheel on our personal automobiles? Like, how is that going to work? Would it be Uber? And people were like, Amy, that's so passé. Like, we're not even working on that anymore. We're doing drones that can carry people from rooftop to rooftop, so you'll be out of the traffic. And I was like, oh my God, it's like everybody's like, you know, 50 steps ahead, and will that really ever happen? And I tried to sort of capture that idea in the book, that there were all these groups out there, whether they were in the United States or in China, you know, doing some things that sound very Jetsons, in allusion to the old cartoon show. And what were all those technologies going to mean? What were they going to mean for the oil industry? What do they mean for our attempt to reduce emissions? What would they mean for human rights and privacy?
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading the book, it had this, it was this almost real-time effect where I'd be reading a section on the need for the United States to adopt industrial policy, and then the news flash on the computer screen was, you know, Senate passes industrial policy bill. It was like you were bringing about the events by writing about them in the book, and I think that's because of the way you researched it. But there is actually a role you played in sort of bringing about some of these changes. Like the Washington Post reported that you played a role in Andy Kirshner's rise or vote into the Exxon board. Is that right?
I did. I introduced Andy to Charlie Penner, who was running part of the campaign for engine number 1. And my idea at the time was that for a company like Exxon, but really for the industry as a whole, being able to have people on the boards that are really in tune with what are the technologies that are coming, you know, where is the opportunity? I mean, Andy Kirshner is an unbelievably successful investor in things that maybe, you know, he was an early investor in Tesla, for example, but also in Nest, right, which is this sort of digital thermostat that is, probably going to become commonplace in people's homes someday. And he was on the board of Applied Materials. There's a sad story about the ineffectiveness of the DOE, where Andy was on the board of Applied Materials, and they had a very interesting technology that they were using to make giant, cheaply make these giant television sets that were flat screen. And they thought that their technology and their materials might be a good fit for making solar panels, for a process for manufacturing solar panels. So they go to DOE to talk to DOE about it. And I won't say which Secretary of Energy it was, but they just said, oh yeah, we're not interested in that. And then later, the government of China became very interested in the technology, and they licensed it. And of course, now they're eating our lunch in solar panel manufacturing using our own technologies. And that was another inspiration for the book, right? Was to just really explain to people, what's happening, that we believe, somewhat correctly, that, the free market and American ingenuity and all those things. I mean, all those things are true, and all those things can help us, sort of be successful in the global marketplace. But we are competing with countries that have, especially China, but also to some extent the EU, that have committed public funds to really making that innovation rapid, and conquering the market, so to speak. And people in this country, I bet there are a lot of people listening that are libertarian in their orientation, and they're saying, oh, the government, shouldn't pick winners, and taxpayer dollars should be spent on something else. But in the end, all the things we use today, come from a lot of things that the Pentagon funded. So in the book, I tell the story about how do we wind up with self-driving cars? Because, you're thinking like Amazon had a program and Google had a program, and all of those people who work in those programs entered a contest that the Pentagon had in the early 2000s to develop a car that would drive itself in the Mojave Desert. And they offered a multi-million-dollar prize. And the first time they did the contest, no one won. None of these tinkerers and scientists and any of these people that we now know of as famous technologists, none of them could come up with a machine that did it. And so they had to have a second round. And eventually they did come up with these technologies. And all the teams, from Carnegie Mellon and from the UC and from Stanford, all these teams that were funded by the Pentagon to participate in that contest, they are all the commercial players today in the companies that are bringing forward these technologies. And of course, people don't remember the origins of GPS. So let me share that one, because that's also a great story. Where would we all be without our GPS? In New Orleans now, nobody has their GPS because the towers are down. It's like a crisis, because who has a map anymore, right? So we developed GPS because the Russians launched the Sputnik satellite, and it was shocking, and we need to know where it was. And scientists got together and they developed this tracking system so they could know where the Sputnik satellite was. And that laid the basis for what we now use commonly in everybody's little phone as GPS.
That is an incredible story. I mean, the term that really kind of resonates through the whole book is a sort of path dependency, and the way that a government policy can really create a certain destiny for and end up lowering costs and sort of paving the way for decades of investment.
I mean, if you think about 5G and the things that are going to come, right? Whether we go to electric cars or we go to some other kind of system, even if you think about COVID today, just to give you guys an idea, e-commerce is up 44% just in 1 year, right? Because of COVID. So, but what the choices that the government makes can make a big difference. And, reason I have a chapter on the early 1900s, turn of the century.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping you'd talk about.
Yeah, is that it's so analogous to today. And things happened that were unexpected because this huge period of innovation. America was just electrifying. You suddenly had the Ford Motor Company with the assembly process. I'd say that's sort of analogous today to 3D printing, which is just taking off, right? So you had these new manufacturing techniques, you had new technologies, and the choices that were made over time, when you think about it, it's now 100 years later. And, choices that Edison made in his fight with Tesla about whether it was AC or DC, like we're still having those choices and talking about whether or not we want to revise that now 100 years later. So, but I like to tell the story because it's so not the way people think about our history. In 1895, there were 850 electric trolley systems in cities across the United States with 10,000 miles of track. And by 1902, average trips for Americans was 4.8 billion trips that Americans had taken between 1895 and 1902, getting around on these electric streetcars. Because now in Houston, we're talking about going to an electric light rail, right? But we had all that. And then the other thing I like to tell people as a statistic is that in 1912, there were 6,000 different models of EVs that were for sale and used in the market in the United States. And they had a range of between 40 and 100 miles of battery charge. And they could go between 30 and 40 miles per hour. There was a car called the Baker Roadster, which Jay Leno has one, an antique, that went 40 miles an hour. And the roads weren't good enough in the United States to go 40 miles an hour anywhere. So, I mean, that was sort of fast enough. And those cars were actually pretty affordable. A cheap version of an EV in 1912 cost what is the equivalent today of $22,000. And, the sort of Tesla of EVs in those days was $146,000. And people had chargers in their home. GE had a product called the Electrant, which looked kind of like a fire hydrant, but it was a charger. And it was very prestigious for urban women to have their own electric car and to have these chargers. And so you have all these portraits of these wealthy women from New York City and Boston and places like that, and they're having their picture taken with their electric charger. So it was really a big deal. And people don't realize what happened is during World War I, there was a metal shortage. And so at that time, Ford had developed the Model T not to compete in cities. That wasn't his intention, because there wasn't electrification in the farmland where he was from. He had developed this car that he originally intended to run on corn ethanol, so that farmers would also have access to vehicles, the common man. And then eventually, it turned into a gasoline vehicle. And now we know the story now. Now where it's like, we're talking about in 1912, if you wanted to get around, you would literally, in New York City, you would call a taxi company and they would come and pick you up in an electric car. And they'd drive you around. And then when the battery started to get low, they'd go back to the depot, they'd put in a new battery and they'd keep driving people around. Well, we're talking about going back to that system. I mean, we're talking about having, the ride sharing companies have these robot cars that were going to pick us up in New York City and take us to different places. And it's going to be coordinated with your smartphone. So they're going to know when you're coming out of the subway system and that you need to go 10 blocks and it's raining, and the thing is just going to be there, a van or a little car, and it's going to pick you up and take you where you need to go. And if you think about the path dependency of the fact that we had that system in 1912, suppose we'd never pivoted to Ford's car. suppose Ford had, like he was trying with Edison, made an electric car. We'd be in a totally different place today. All we would literally have to do is, change it to self-driving. We'd be ready to go. And we
Right.
could just clean up the electricity supply.
It's incredible. I just a week ago, I was having ice cream with my family on Heights Boulevard, and there were some teenager boys who kind of walked up from their neighborhood, and then somebody else bicycled up, and you could feel like the bones of a neighborhood that was organized around that kind of electric trolleys, that it's still there. And you're sitting there and you look at this esplanade with all these mature trees in the middle of the street, but it wasn't always a little park in the middle of the street. That's where the trolleys ran.
Right, exactly.
That's where the electric transit was. It was really there. We lost it.
It is really interesting to think about that. And with all due respect to Tom DeLay constantly bringing, congressional dollars to build wider and wider highways in Houston, I laugh with people, the more highway lanes you have, the more cars there are, the more traffic there is, the longer it takes to get anywhere, right? So, now we have a real challenge because of COVID, because, people are concerned about going into public transit again. And, what is the path forward? And I think it's going to be really interesting to see, are people going to go back to the cities? How will they get around? Are people going to do what I call living locally, even if you're living in a city? You're going to work and go shopping and, eat out in a certain radius where you can walk. Even Houston, the younger people, for a period of time, I don't know if it's still true, we're starting to live down by West Dallas and then walk everywhere. Same thing, Midtown had that potential, right? So, it's really interesting to think about, if you could wave a magic wand and plan out infrastructure instead of having it just happen accidentally, what would you do? And then, I think the other thing that I think about a lot when we're talking about seawalls, today's a good day to talk about seawalls and levees. Hope that's not like politically incorrect, but, we're experiencing yet, another major storm in New Orleans. And I think the question is, people would say, listen, this is an example where there's no electricity. So if you had an electric car, you'd be whatever, and you'd be better off with gasoline. But, is that really true? And this is what I would tell you from the experience of Hurricane Sandy. So if I had an electric car and I have a generator, I can charge my car. If I have fuel for my generator, right? Or if my generator was a battery, which I was charging with the solar panel on my house or a solar array that was in my little neighborhood, and we all had little batteries in our house like they did in South Australia, at least if it was sunny, we would have some electricity, which we could use for our cars. But how long is it going to take for there to be enough electricity to not only re-electrify all the gasoline pumps in New Orleans, but the wholesale rack and the refineries? I mean, the amount of restoration that has to come to get the gasoline system back up and running is actually quite a bit of electrification. And I, as an individual consumer, have no control over it. And so the industry does a good job. I know in some states like Florida, they now require the industry to keep generators at gasoline stations on major evacuation highways. I see somebody in the chat is saying if your generator ran on trash, 200%. I have an entry on that. I worked on that trash to energy technology pathway in California. That is a major potential pathway. I mean, talk about solving two problems at once. And, it's possible, right? We know what the technology would be. So it's just a question of, there's big companies like Air Liquide that are working on getting it down to the size of your trash masher. I mean, imagine if you had a trash masher in your house, and what it did was generate electricity that then went into a battery that you could then use. And what if that battery was your Ford 150? Because there was just a news story just a couple days ago about a couple that lost their electricity because of the bad weather, and they were able to keep access to medical and other equipment that they needed by plugging their car into their house and having it serve as a generator. So there's a lot of change coming, and it's really important to think about not how to repair or build a wall around things that we're used to having, but how to mix different systems that we have to transition over time to make us more resilient, because the weather is not going to be good. And we need to be able to think about not what is the way we used to do this. We need to think about what is the best way to do this.
I see we have a comment about distributed energy, just to add to your point, with the winter storm, we heard that kind of argument too. I get a lot of letters, part of my job is to look at the letters, and many people write in saying, well, our grid collapsed. Just imagine what would happen to our grid if all these folks were plugging in their cars. That would add to the burden on the grid, and it would just collapse all the more frequently. But I think the point you make in your book, and I love that you went back to Richard Smalley's dream, but with the distributed network, with everybody having like batteries at home, it would actually help smooth over peaks in the demand. Would it solve all of our grid problems? No, but it certainly would actually help not hinder.
Let me tell the Richard Smalley story, because it's Houston audience and such an amazing story. It's a fun story. We're at Rice, and we're going to make a birthday party for Neil Lane. Many of you might know Neil Lane. He was the science advisor of President Clinton, former provost of Rice, former head of the National Science Foundation. And so for his birthday, we decided we'd make like a science party where we'd have people come and talk about, scientific breakthroughs in different fields. And Rick Smalley wanted to be on the energy panel. And people called me and they said, maybe we want Rick to be on the nano panel. And I was like, listen, I'm not telling a guy who's a Nobel what panel he can be on, right? And so I had to make all these deals with all these scientists to keep Rick on the energy panel. And then I never told him. And, I don't talk to him for a couple of weeks. It was the summer. I run to the auditorium at Rice because I'm looking forward to hearing his talk. And I don't know, like 2 months before, Peter Hartley, who's an economist in the economics department at Rice, and I and a few others had explained to Rick about this problem that you can't store electricity and what it means. And I come to his talk, and he has this whole talk about how the problem with scientists is they're trying to come up with a storage technology or an electricity solution that is at the scale of a nuclear power plant or at the scale of a city, and that they're not going to succeed. But that if they broke it down to this scale of like a household appliance, this is how it would work. And he had this whole schematic that he laid out about how this system, which we now have a name for, it's called virtual power plant, how this virtual power plant system would work, where everybody would have these little units, and then you'd aggregate them so that if I normally only use 40% of my home battery, my utility would have the right through a contract to take my other 60% of electricity stored and use it during a peak heat crisis or during a cold winter moment, or just to back up intermittent renewables. And the reason I tell that story is because Rick Smalley gave that talk in the early 2000s. And I miss him every day. In fact, I have to tell you, I had a dream very recently that I was somewhere and I was going to give a book talk in person, which I hope we get to. And Rick Smalley was there and he was sitting next to me. And I remember thinking in my dream, God, is he angry with me for taking all his ideas and putting them in my book? But no, he was very happy to hear my talk. And the point is, they've built that system that he described them in a theoretical way. Elon Musk has built that system in Australia, in Western Australia, where they had brownouts every day. And since they put that system in, they have not had brownouts, right? It worked. Now, I'm not saying it would work everywhere, but it's definitely worked when it was installed in Australia. And again, it's just a new option we have. And I think that, you know, one of the most important things is we need to move away. I mean, listen to all of you, you know, just because I don't live there anymore doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to this. We need to move away from this political wrapping where each side pretends it was the other energy technology's fault that we didn't have our electricity or we couldn't use our car, right? We're going to have a transition. There are going to be technologies that are superior, and we're going to move to them. And we're going to move to them because they're going to provide better service for our values. And those values are going to be generational. And, you know, I had this thing I said to people 5 years ago. I'm going to say it again. If somebody told you that you could save a lot of money if you went back to an analog phone and had it connected by wire, and you wouldn't have to have, suddenly you wake up in the morning and your teenager, you know, did some data thing and now you have an extra $300 charge, that could never happen to you. You'd be totally $25 a month forever. None of you would pick that choice. None of you would pick that choice. Why? Because you're holding a computer in your hand. It's not really a telephone. It has all kinds of other utilities. And that's the way we need to think about the energy system. We have new utilities that we have to do and take care of. We have to worry about cyber, right? We have to worry about extreme weather. And we have to think about literally people's welfare.
Well, that's where
people dying because we picked the wrong technology. Like, we need to come up with systems that are integrating new technologies in a way that we give ourselves the most flexibility.
That's where I want to jump in. We had a good question about, you know, rare earth metals from Afghanistan, and I just want to step back from that question. Maybe you can come back to it, but you know, I'm afraid people will just, from this discussion, they'll think we're just a couple of
we're just
tree
a bunch
huggers.
of greens. Yeah, we're just
but I mean, what's maybe the most persuasive angle of the book is, or one of the main themes of the book is national security, right? And I mean, it's not something on the side. It's square in your sights. The question of you know, this transition will happen, but who will make it happen? Who will control the technologies? And what are the repercussions if the United States isn't the one leading, right? And there was some. I got scared, honestly, reading the book, thinking about the potential for domination of this space by
authoritarian regimes.
By authoritarian regimes. Yeah. So could you speak to that?
Yeah. So you know, it's a very important topic, and the idea that the United States could politically decide to not go forward on technology doesn't mean that other countries wouldn't go forward on technology. I mean, the Europeans have announced a $1 trillion initiative to go to these new technologies. China has made it a matter of national security to try to dominate in the digital space. And that means that if we don't invest in that same thing, how are you going to keep me safe? Right? So if we're not studying encryption, we're not developing AI, we're just buying self-driving vehicles from China, we're buying other kinds of vehicles from China, we're buying everything from China, you know, you could see what could go wrong. Today in China, if you, they use facial recognition software as a political tool. And they monitor everybody's, you know, social media, obviously. So in China, you know, in America, if you are a young person starting out and you get a job and you pay your bills, you know, you can get a small credit card, then you pay your bills, you get a better, more credit, and then eventually, you know, hopefully, you know, you're more successful and you can get better credit and eventually be able to have a house and other kinds of things that really make your life more enjoyable. And in China, those things are not connected to whether or not you're paying your bills. I mean, paying your bills is important, but those things are connected to what the Chinese government has observed you under surveillance doing on social media and in your daily life. So if you show up at a protest, that might mean you can't rent an apartment, you can't buy a home, you can't get food. In Venezuela, you know, they have surveillance on you. If they see you doing something that's a protest or whatever, you can't get your electronic food card, you can't have food. Right? So it's important not only that the United States lead in all these technologies, it's important that we lead in how these technologies are regulated in the United States, that we put limits on what the government can do with these technologies. We put limits on what those companies themselves can collect about us and sell to somebody else. I mean, I have to tell you, having researched this book, I'm afraid to have Alexa, right? I don't want to have Google have a tape recording of everything I've said inside my house. So, you know, we really have to think about what are the protections that go with this. And then if I had Alexa, do I have to worry about if, you know, China doesn't like what I wrote in this book, and they want to prevent me from doing book events? You know, do I have to worry about them breaking into my Alexa? Do I have to worry if I had a self-driving car? You know, recently there was a story about a man who got locked into his Tesla. There was some digital glitch and he couldn't unlock his car. You can imagine a foreign government coming in and hassling someone by locking them in their car. Or if we're in a car where we're not actually driving, you're sitting in the back seat and the car's taking you where you need to go. Like, it has to be that we're superior, because it can't be that some foreign government would decide that they're going to assassinate, you know, the president of a corporation or a senior senator by sending their vehicle into a wall. Like, I don't think that people have really understood, you know, they understand the fact that their privacy is being compromised now in general, but they don't understand what that would mean in a war. And we have to lead. We have to not only have the most superior technology, we have to lead in showing how to use that technology correctly in a democracy, because otherwise there'll be no democracy.
Yeah, I've been thinking when the masks debate came out, really hit us hard last year. You know, I had a little bit of whiplash because I was in London for a conference, and I had walked across one of the old bridges, and there was this protest of Hong Kong protesters, and they were protesting a ban on masks by the Chinese government. They wanted the right to wear masks so that they could disguise themselves from the surveillance state, right? And then I come back to the United States, and people are protesting masks. Protesting the mask mandates because they're saying it was an infringement on their liberty. But we might need those masks. We might need them to have any chance of not being monitored all the time. I wanted to come to one of these questions. It says the huge success of Standard Oil originally was getting everyone to accept spec standard for oil and petroleum. So I wanted to come back to this question of Exxon. You know, and we were talking about Andy Karshner. You know, I once had the chance to see the new Exxon campus. I worked for an architecture magazine, so I got an architectural tour of the new campus and the new buildings. And the first thing that happens when you walk into the gate, the main building, which is this huge cantilevered thing with this floating
Everything's floating glass,
floating glass
walking on glass, yeah.
But you walk in and there's this 6-story tall wall of names of people who have gotten patents for Exxon. I mean, it's huge, hundreds of names. And it really makes clear that Exxon is a tech company.
Right.
It is a tech company. And if you think about it that way, and then it gives me some hope, right? Like, what if the engineers, all these incredibly brilliant people at Exxon, were given a different set of challenges to solve, right?
And think about it just as a business proposition. You know, no offense to Exxon, but other companies have made decisions about either a certain kind of alternative technology to invest in or a certain kind of oil technology to invest in and done better, right? And, people said to me, who's Andy Karshner? Why would a guy like Andy Karshner be a fit for Exxon's board? In my mind, what Exxon's board needs to do is refresh itself with people who are going to be able to make decisions and offer good advice about what kind of technologies are going to be winners in the future. Because that's exactly right. You've got a company of scientists. And no offense to the past management of this company, they have chosen wrong in multiple ways.
So in their defense, though, right, they've announced, I think, a $5 billion or multi-billion-dollar investment in what seems to be carbon storage, and with respect to all the excited comments and our own conversation about this transition and all the technological opportunity with distributed energy and wind and solar, we are not there yet, right? I mean, in the next 10 years, we're just not ready to support all the energy demands in the United States, and definitely not across the world, with wind and solar, even if we try to go as fast as we can, right? And so you have these oil and gas companies who are calling for subsidies or some kind of carbon tax that would make the economics work for carbon storage and sequestration. So my question is that really the right path? Is that a bridge to the future, or is it a way of fixing ourselves on the wrong path dependency, just pouring billions of dollars more into the wrong direction and just sort of freezing ourselves or locking ourselves into more carbon dependent sort of dinosaur tech?
You know, here's the thing about technology, right? It takes a visionary view. We know there's certain functions, certain parts of the across the industrial spectrum where, you know, sequestration might be the best solution. I mean, we don't know. I mean, we haven't cracked that puzzle, right? And you know, I think the problem that people have is that the money that's been spent hasn't been spent well. You know,
right? Like Petronova is this. We had this huge experiment with carbon sequestration right in our backyard in Fort Bend County, I think, and it failed. Right? It's been close.
right. But
Why should I believe that carbon sequestration will work if our one big?
I mean, I'm not going to be able to talk about the technology properly, but as you know, there's a natural gas plant that's an experimental plant, a thermal, you know, power station that's actually burning the CO2 and would be a zero emissions way of turning natural gas into electricity, right? So there are technologists out there that are doing, you know, very interesting things. So when people say to me, you know, people say to me, like, why are you saying that the oil industry should put tech people on their boards, right? I'm saying because, you know, fresh pair of eyes, like, have different perspectives, you know, think about things in a different way. I think the biggest problem, you know, I say it about myself. How did I become successful in this business in Houston? I mean, you know, you guys now, like, you know, blushes off the bloom. I'm working for a university based in Boston, and that matches my accent. I don't have to keep apologizing for my accent all the time, right? But I mean, you know, the bottom line is I came into writing about the oil market from a different perspective. You know, I was trained to understand how the futures market worked. Then I understood how the futures market was going to revolutionize the way oil was traded. People at the time in Houston were just learning about futures and how it might apply to oil. And I was a person who was an early writer about the futures market. So I was a little bit ahead. And then, you know, I think I've really made a career out of being a little bit ahead. That's why, you know, if you're in oil and you're not looking at digital, you're not looking a little bit ahead, you're looking backward, right? So, you know, even for the shale, you know, digital is a very important part of making sure your water's going in the right place, making sure that you're effectively not wasting direction, resources, that you're, you know, digital is going to be the way that's going to end methane leakage. I mean, all of these technologies, the sensors, you know, but then there's other responsibilities that come with that. Let me just take 2 minutes to tell the Colonial Pipeline story. I mean, a lot of people in the industry know that story, but Colonial had gone digital. So I'm sure there was a time when, you know, Colonial Pipeline had people who had levers, who pushed the lever up and down, made a delivery of product, and then wrote down how much was delivered. And then somebody made a paper invoice, you know, from that note of that person pushing the lever up and down. And it went to a billing office, and all that paperwork, you know, turned into an invoice that was then mailed to someone, right? So, you know, the new owners of Colonial, this brilliant idea. They can fire a lot of human beings and lower their costs if they just use digital sensors for everything. So they had a digital sensors along the pipeline that automated it by computer, how to make deliveries, how much, you know, to the molecule. They can tell you the quality of that gasoline, the quality of that, you know, distillate, and how many minutes, you know, the delivery took, and how many molecules of material went into somebody's storage tank or distribution pipeline. And it was all digitized. And then that digital data went through encryption to the business office. And then, they made invoices that went to you electronically, and then you electronically paid it with your electronic bank. So like you barely needed people because it was all done by computer. What's the problem? The problem is if you're doing all of that and you don't know that your data and your passwords were floating around in the dark web. Are you sure that it was just the billing office? Because the billing office was connected with encrypted data that was connected to encrypted data that ran the pipeline. Right? So, there are going to be all these technologies that are very enabling, but they also have, requirements and responsibilities that go with it. And the energy industry has a huge responsibility to protect us so that the very infrastructure that's providing us with necessary energy doesn't become a weapon of which an accident could kill us through the intervention of a foreign hacker.
Wow.
I mean, just the magnitude of what responsibility is coming. And you're not going to be able to avoid digital technologies because it's like saying, oh, let's all stop using our cell phone. Let's not use email. I'm not going to do electronic banking. Like, we're not going backwards. So we have to think about how we're going to go forwards in a way that is useful.
We have a question. I'm not sure if this is something you looked at, but we have a question about open air carbon capture technology that would be economic and effective. It seems to me that solving the science question will ultimately solve climate change. Have you looked into that when in your Silicon Valley tours or other research?
People have those technologies. I would say I'm definitely not an expert on that technology. Like many technologies, the question is, how easy is that going to be to do on scale? Right? So, there's Oxy's invested in a company, and there's some other companies in Europe, and they have interesting technologies, and those technologies work, right? But the question is, how much carbon will we be able to pull out of the air through these technologies and store versus what can we eliminate by either living differently or having our use technologies be different? And, my opinion is it's going to be a combination of approaches. And, that's what makes horse racing. But, hearkening back to Exxon's board, they have not yet picked a winner. And other companies have invested in things that have turned out to be, pretty promising at the same time. And so, it's how do I refresh myself? How do I learn things that I didn't previously know? And, one thing I tell people, because I've had the luxury to do this mainly because of all of you, right? I have the luxury to be, I see Bob Kleinberg is here. I mean, he had this phrase, which I love, being a lifetime learner, right? And, what do people like me do? Like someone's paying me to be a lifetime, Steve Kleinberg, to be a lifetime learner. And ultimately, we all kind of need to be moving in that direction, right? Because we are at a period of intensive technological change, and we have major challenges that we need to solve. And those two things can come together in a positive way, or they could come together in a really dystopic way. And we could wind up like China, which would be a very bad outcome. And that's really why I wrote the book, because just understanding that there's some really positive things that can come from these technologies, but also there's some really negative things that can come from these technologies. And we have a lot of smart people in this country, mobilizing ourselves, including the, hundreds of thousands of scientists that work in the oil and gas industry, to figure out how to do this in a way that has a positive impact on society and on the next generation, I mean, everyone should want to do that. It's not about how much money am I going to make this year. You know, have a little foresight and have some ability to sort of think beyond that, and think about, you know, what's your legacy.
So I'm at church. I'm sitting next to Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, or John Cornyn, or I'm at church and I'm sitting next to the CEO of a major energy company. What would your parting advice be to me? What should I tell them?
I think you should tell them that we have a once in a lifetime opportunity now to use the assets we have for good. And we have amazing assets that we can use for good. And if you're bothering to sit in church, you obviously know that using those assets for good is worth doing, or you wouldn't be sitting there. And you need to step it up.
Well, Amy and Raj, what an amazing conversation. This hour just flew by. So I just want to thank you guys for a really provocative discussion. And Amy, I would usually say that, our loss is Boston's gain, but we have digital technologies here. So we get to share an hour with you. And obviously you have so many friends in Houston, many of them who put comments in the chat. I hope you'll find ways to be back with us, and we'll find ways to give you more opportunities to do that, because I think we've learned so much from you just hearing you and spending an hour with you.
I miss Houston, and I spent a lot of time in Houston after Harvey, being with friends and talking to groups, and I really feel strongly the Center for Houston's Future is doing a good job. And Greater Houston Partnership's doing a good job trying to provide some leadership. Chronicle's providing leadership, and we need to think outside the box, and that includes Senator Cruz. We need to think outside of the box.
Well, we're going to get those 25 to 30 leaders together from Silicon Valley and Houston, and we're going to have that conversation, and hopefully you're going to come back and lead us through that. So that's perhaps our next step. Just a reminder, Amy's book is really great. If you want a copy, it's sitting there on her mantle. I see that behind her.
Yeah, see that? Yeah, that's right.
If you want a copy and have her autograph it, just sign up on our website. We'll put you in our book order. So Raj and Amy, thank you so much for being with us. Our next webcast, I think you're just a great lead-in, is Ann Stern and Scott McClellan, and that will be on September 23rd. So hope you'll be there. And then following that, on October 6th, we're going to have Catherine Hayhoe from Tech, who I know, Amy, you know well.
Very well,
yeah. And we'll talk and continue to keep the conversation going. So I just want to thank you guys for being so generous with your time. Thank you for the audience for being here, and look forward to finding ways to work together going forward.
Very good.
Okay, take care, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.